Okay, guys, so this week we are going to move towards, as you all know, my favorite area of research. And so we're going to be looking at English medium instruction, and we're going to be looking this week at the genesis of the phenomenon. So, where and how and why exactly did it start, and how it's developed a little bit since then. Okay, so we're going to, in this process, we're going to look at it from both a domestic and from an international point of view. So, this particular diagram figure is taken from my book. So on the left hand side we have all of the domestic factors that have come to bear on the introduction of English medium instruction programs in the German context. But what you'll see as we go through the PowerPoint, a lot of these factors are actually also going to be relevant to other national contexts. Really, it's the international factors on the right hand side of the slide here that we're going to concentrate on. And in particular, we're going to look at four key factors. We're going to look at the dominance of English as a global language in key domains. Okay, so that's something we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, about how English has become the lingua academica, how it's become the de facto sole language of publication in all scientific outlets. We can see that it's dominant in the cultural sphere, including entertainment and mass media. We can see that it's dominant on the political side, so just looking at organisations like the European Union, English has become the de facto sole working language of all of the European Union's organs, and indeed in business it has become a lingua franca for most interactions within the business sphere. Okay, so we're not really going to talk about that one very much because we've been talking about it quite a lot up until this point, but as we know, there is this been growing dominance of English as a global language in multiple key domains, and of course this dominance of the language, particularly in the academic domain, has a major impact on the move towards English medium instruction. One of the key areas that we're going to look at is the move towards the internationalization of higher education systems, and indeed the globalization of higher education. Okay, so these kind of two factors that interact and relate to one another have had a massive influence on how higher education looks today, and also how English medium instruction feeds into that. And then the last pillar of these key international developments, we're going to look at the Bologna process and the Lisbon strategy, because these two particular initiatives, developments, have been key in advancing the situation with English medium instruction in European higher education. So these two kind of major policy developments have kind of created the conditions for EMI to become such a huge phenomenon in European higher education. Okay, so here we're going to talk a little bit about globalization and internationalization, and obviously, we all think we know exactly what globalization is, what internationalization is, but to be frank, there's so many definitions floating around, and many of them can be useful, many of them can maybe be lacking a little bit in specificity. So what we're going to do now is going to drill down a little bit on defining what exactly we mean by globalization and internationalization, and then talk a little bit about how these forces are shaping higher education. So one of the most widely cited definitions that you will see around is a fairly neutral definition by Held in 1999, where he talks about the widening, deepening and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness. Okay, so quite a nice neutral working definition, allows you to kind of get to the heart of what exactly globalization is. And it can be very useful because, as we know as well, it's not subject to all the ideological baggage and national associations that exist with the term globalization. So globalization, depending on your national context, can have hugely different connotations attached to it. Certainly in many continental European countries, globalization is almost always associated with the United States, Americanization, the dumbing down process, the dominance of the international market. So it has a lot of ideological baggage that can go with it. Whereas in other countries, then maybe it's a little bit more neutral. So this particular definition here can be useful to move away from the kind of the ideological baggage that goes with some of the other definitions that are out there. But I suppose one of the major drawbacks of this particular definition is that it fails to capture the increased integration of world systems. So it talks about an interconnectedness, but globalization, as we know and as we're seeing, it doesn't just interconnect world systems. What it actually is doing is integrating world systems so that every part of the system is reliant on the other in order to function properly. So there's more of an integration of world systems than it is an interconnection of them. Okay, so one of the kind of more nuanced definitions that I've come across during my time working in this area that I find quite interesting is the following by night and to wit. And this is a lot more nuanced because it talks about the various forces that come to bear within the context of globalization. So it talks about the flow of technology, economy, knowledge, people, values, and ideas across borders, which affects each country in a different way due to a nation's individual history, traditions, culture, and priorities. So I really like this definition because it's very all-encompassing in the sense of talking about the various forces that are taking place within globalization. But what I also like about it is that it says that not every country is affected in the same way, and actually it's the country's individual histories and traditions and cultures and priorities that can influence how that country reacts to globalization. So that one I think is a particularly useful one, and that's certainly one that we're going to keep using as we move forward. So we talk about internationalization and globalization, and sometimes the two are confused with one another. Some people will say the globalization of higher education, whereas the vast majority of researchers will talk about the internationalization of higher education, because internationalization still has connotations of control, that there's a control element there, that the education systems, or certainly at least the national governments, can still control what happens to their higher education system, whereas globalization is more seen as a unstoppable force, a force that does what it wants, when it wants, and how it wants, so that it can't be controlled or can't be steered, where internationalization is still under the control of nation states. Okay. So how did it come to pass that globalization, which has been primarily associated with technology and the economy, how did that come to bear on the internationalization of the universities? Well, really, one of the major things to talk about here is the development of what's called the knowledge economy. And really, there's lots and lots of different permutations of it: knowledge-based economy, knowledge society, knowledge nation. So there's all these similar terms out there, but they all drill down to the same idea that pretty much all of the so-called Western world, so the most developed nations within the OECD, have all moved away from the physical production of capital as the way of deriving their economies, moved that away from that towards what's called the knowledge economy, whereby the most developed countries in the world use ideas, knowledge, creativity, and innovation as the capital to drive their economies. Okay, so we're seeing that the vast majority of OECD countries have moved towards that, and even if you look at the global spread, a huge amount of the traditional money-making industries in the West, so talking about manufacturing, computers, that sort of thing, all of that has shifted east towards Asian economies. So what we see is that different countries are specializing in different parts of the production cycle, so that the more developing or less developed countries are specializing in the areas of physical manufacturing, whereas the more developed economies of the world that already had that phase of being involved in manufacturing have now moved on to the generation of knowledge and ideas as the main way of driving their economies. And we can see that certainly even in the Irish context, where we've moved away quite significantly from manufacturing and engineering towards the more knowledge-based services, talking about financial services and these kind of things. And I suppose then, where does higher education come into it? Well, if knowledge is going to become the new driving force, the new way of making money in the economy, then higher education institutions now have a huge impact on that, because they have a really dominant role in the creation and the dissemination of knowledge, because that is the function of the higher education institution, is the pursuit of knowledge and the education of people through new knowledge generation. So therefore, within this knowledge-based economy, we're seeing that higher education institutions are increasingly becoming involved in the economic cycle. Okay, and then I suppose one of the major developments in the area that has caused higher education to become to enter the field of capital creation was the move towards integrating higher education into the GATS agreement, so the General Agreement on Trade in Services. So up until that point, higher education was not a commodity. It was not something that would be traded in global markets. Whereas when it was added to the GATS initiative, it was agreed that higher education would become yet another good that could be traded in the international arena. And then, of course, we're also saying that information technology is accelerating and making things an awful lot easier for us to connect, which on the one hand is very positive, but on the flip side, it's creating an increased level of integration so that higher education institutions globally, now within this kind of economic sphere of acting as a commodity so that they're selling goods and services to people, they now enter into this competitive process and this marketization of higher education. And then also one of the major impacts here, and we'll talk about it again just at the very end when we're looking at the domestic side of things, is a change in governance structures and systems in place within universities. So from the 1980s onwards, national governments decided to increasingly pull away towards funding higher education as a public good, and decided to create new governance structures and systems within higher education institutions so that they could start to self-fund. So they started to move away from the kind of more Humboldtian idea of Bildung, of education, towards a kind of a service or a commodity that could be sold within a particular market. So they moved away from the kind of more European idea of higher education towards a more North American model of money making and self-financing. So then if we look at internationalization, we've talked about how we go about defining globalization. How then do we go about, defining internationalization? Well, we can say that internationalization varies across time, space, and context. So unlike globalization, which shares a lot of factors across national context, given that it's a kind of a self-catalyzing force that can't really be controlled, internationalization is different because it does vary from time to time across different spaces and jurisdictions, and within particular contexts there are different ideologies and moves within internationalization that are going on. Internationalization, like globalization or like the knowledge economy, has lots of different terminological manifestations. So we can see internationalization is probably the most commonly used term nowadays, but certainly we also see other types of terms popping up like international education, multicultural education, etc. So depending obviously on the focus of the internationalization activities, other terms have emerged to describe higher education's response to internationalizing in a certain way. Okay, so the most widely used term, or the most used definition of internationalization, we see coming from Kame, DeWitt, and Wächter. And what they talk about, and Knight in particular takes this forward, and she talks about the process of integrating an international, intercultural, or global dimension into the purpose, functions, or delivery of post-secondary education. So in this definition, we see lots and lots of really important facets coming out that need to be discussed in isolation. So I suppose the first one is process. Yeah. So the fact that it's described as a process is really important because it talks about the evolutionary nature of internationalization. And if we go right back to the very top here of the slide, we talk about it. It varies across time, space, and context. Internationalization never stands still. It's always evolving as a concept depending on the priorities at a particular time and space that the institution wants to invest in. So it's very much an evolutionary idea, internationalization. Then we talk about that it's integrated in some way. And this is really important, that internationalization doesn't just become lip service, and that it actually becomes fully embedded into the policies and programs of the university. So it isn't simply a matter of